On a Sunday afternoon in June of 1993, water started dripping through a ceiling in a South Minneapolis apartment building. A tenant on a lower floor noticed it first, a slow seep coming down into their unit, and they reported it. A caretaker and a security guard went upstairs to find the source. What they found in Unit 2104 was a shower running full blast, flooding the apartment, and on the bedroom floor, partway under the bed, the body of the woman who lived there. Her name was Jeanie Ann Childs. She was 35 years old. She had been stabbed 65 times. For nearly 25 years after that afternoon, no one knew who did it. The unknown killer had left his DNA all over that apartment, on a comforter, on towels, on a washcloth, on a t-shirt in the bathroom sink. But in 1993, that DNA matched no one. It sat in a file, a genetic fingerprint belonging to a man the system could not name, because that man had no felony record to put him in any database. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a career criminal. He was a married businessman with 3 kids, a man who cheered his children through a hockey-playing childhood, a suburban dad with a convenience store and a crop insurance job and a quiet life in a small Minnesota town. His name was Jerry Westrom. And the reason he was finally caught isn't a fingerprint or a confession or a witness who came forward. It's a napkin he wiped his mouth with at his daughter's college hockey game and threw in a lobby trash can while an FBI agent stood nearby and watched. This is the story of how a woman the system had almost given up on got her name back, and how a science that didn't exist in 1993 reached across 26 years to find the one man nobody was looking for. If you're new here, this channel tells the stories of forgotten victims who finally got justice. If that matters to you, subscribe. Before we get to any of it, you need to know who Jeanie Ann Childs was. Because she wasn't just a name in a case file, and she wasn't just the difficult circumstances of how she died. She was a person, and she was somebody's daughter and somebody's big sister. Jeanie had a mother named Betty Eekman. She had a sister named Cindy Bloomer, who was 12 years younger than her, young enough to look up at Jeanie the way a little sister looks up at the big one. And it's Cindy who left us the picture of Jeanie that matters most, the one that has nothing to do with a crime scene. Cindy remembered what her sister was like when the music played. When a Lionel Richie song came on, Cindy said Jeanie's fingers would start snapping and she would dance around. That's the image to hold on to. A woman who heard a song she loved and couldn't keep still, whose whole body answered the music before she'd even decided to move. Jeanie's life wasn't easy, and her family never pretended otherwise. By her mother's account, Jeanie lost her way around the age of 12 or 13. She started running away from home, again and again, and Betty spent years chasing after her, trying to pull her back. "I took my life in my own hands many a times to track her down," Betty said. That's a mother who never stopped reaching for a child who kept slipping out of reach. Jeanie had been married twice, and she stayed close to stepchildren from a previous marriage. There were people in her life who loved her. By the time she died, Jeanie was working as a sex worker in Minneapolis. That's a fact of her life, and it's the reason her case ran into the difficulties it did. It's not a description of who she was. It didn't make her any less her mother's daughter or any less the woman who danced when Lionel Richie came on. Keep that straight through everything that follows, because in 1993, a lot of people didn't, and Jeanie waited a very long time because of it. Now here's what we know about the last day of her life. It was Sunday, June 13th, 1993. That weekend, Jeanie hadn't been feeling well. She'd gone to an emergency room for tooth pain, the kind of ordinary, miserable errand anyone runs. She was alive that weekend, dealing with a toothache, and by Sunday afternoon, she was gone. She was 35 years old, and she died in her own apartment, in the place where she should have been safest. The attack was savage, and I'm going to state the fact once and then leave it, because Jeanie deserves better than to be described by her wounds. She was stabbed 65 times. She had defensive wounds on her hands, which tells you she fought, that she saw it coming and tried to stop it. The violence moved from room to room in that apartment. One of the forensic scientists who worked the scene, a man named Bart Epstein, called it one of the bloodiest that he'd been to. That's all we need to say about it. What matters more is what the killer left behind, because he left a great deal, and one piece of it in particular would still be waiting for him almost 3 decades later. When the caretaker and the security guard found her that afternoon, the shower was still running. That detail matters because water is the enemy of evidence, and the killer may well have counted on it. But he made a mistake. He didn't clean up everything, and he didn't account for what he'd left on the things he couldn't wash away. Minneapolis police arrived and began to work the apartment, and almost right away, something on the floor caught Bart Epstein's eye. Under the bedroom window, pressed into the blood, were bare, bloody footprints, barefoot. Now, here's why that mattered so much. Jeanie was wearing socks. Epstein could see her own socked footprints at the scene, so the bare prints, the ones from a foot with no sock on it, couldn't be hers. That drew my attention right away, Epstein said, and right next to it I see the socked foot of Jeanie Childs. The barefoot prints belonged to the person who killed her. Investigators dusted those prints with black powder right there at the scene and preserved them. A bare footprint lifted off a bedroom floor in 1993. Hold on to that too. It comes back. The knife in the drying rack in the kitchen showed no apparent blood on it. Investigators looked at everything in that apartment and they collected the biological evidence with care. Unknown DNA came off a comforter. It came off towels, off a washcloth, off a t-shirt. It was in the bathroom sink. There were blood scrapings. And when the lab worked it up, they found something that would define the case for the next quarter century. The unknown DNA profile repeated itself throughout the crime scene. It wasn't a stray trace in one spot. The same genetic profile, the same man, was everywhere Jeanie's killer had been. On the bedding, on the bathroom things, in room after room. There was no doubt that whoever left that DNA was the person who killed her. So the police had the killer's genetic fingerprint. What they didn't have was a name to attach to it. They worked the case the way you work a case in 1993. They looked hard at the people around Jeanie. A man named Arthur Gray, who lived with her, became a person of interest early on. There was hair evidence that matched him, and for a while that looked like it might be the answer. But it wasn't. Arthur Gray had an alibi, and it held up. He'd been on a motorcycle trip to Milwaukee that weekend, and it checked out. And his footprints didn't match the barefoot prints under the window. The prints were the killer's, and they weren't his. So Arthur Gray was cleared, cleanly and completely. He didn't do this, and the evidence said so. There was a witness who'd seen Jeanie with a man, described as a tall blonde man wearing a trench coat. It was a lead. But a description of a tall blonde man in a coat, with no name and no face, doesn't take you anywhere on its own, and it never got resolved to anybody at the time. The trail from the witness just stopped, and then the case ran into the wall that would hold it for years. The killer's DNA profile, that repeating profile that was all over the apartment, matched no one. Investigators ran it against the criminal databases, the felony databases, the systems that are supposed to catch exactly this kind of person. Nothing came back. Not in 1993, and not for a long time after. The reason is simple, and it's the whole hinge of this story, so hold on to it. Those databases only contain people who have already been convicted of a qualifying crime. If your killer has a felony record, the database finds him. If he doesn't, the database has never heard of him, and it will return silence no matter how perfect your crime scene DNA is. Jeanie's killer wasn't in the system. And so the best piece of evidence in the entire case, the genetic fingerprint that could not have been more certain, pointed at a blank space where a name should be. There's a harder truth layered underneath the science, and it needs to be said plainly and carefully. Jeanie's death received scant news coverage. Cases from that era involving sex workers were harder to solve and drew less sustained attention from the press and from the public both. That's the honest framing. A DNA profile with nothing to match it to, and a victim whose story the wider world wasn't following. Those two things together are how a case like this goes quiet. Not one dramatic act of neglect, but a slow settling. A file that stays open on paper while the phone stops ringing and the leads run dry and the years start to stack up. But the phone didn't stop ringing entirely, because Jeanie had a mother. Betty Eekman would not let her daughter's case be forgotten, and she made that the work of her life. She stayed on the investigators, not once, not in a burst of grief that faded, but steadily, year after year after year. Many times as I could, she said, but I never let a year go by without reminding them. Think about what that sentence actually means. It means that every single year, for year upon year, a mother picked up the phone or made the trip and reminded the people whose job it was that her daughter was still dead and still unavenged, and that nobody had answered for it. She was the counterweight to the scant coverage. The world may not have been watching Jeannie's case, but Betty was, and she made sure the people who could still do something never got to look away for long. If this case is getting under your skin the way it should, subscribe. The years went by. The evidence sat preserved in the case file, the unknown DNA profile logged and waiting, and every so often it would be run against the databases again as those systems grew. And every time, the same answer came back: no match. The man was still not in the system because he had still never been convicted of anything that would put him there. From 1993 forward, through the rest of the 90s, through the 2000s, the profile stayed a stranger. A perfect genetic portrait of a killer that fit no one the law had ever fingerprinted. And here's the thing about that stretch of quiet. It's easy to say a case went cold, as if cold were a single event, a door closing. It wasn't. It was years. It was Cindy Bloomer growing older with a sister-shaped hole in her family. It was Betty making her yearly calls into what must have felt, some years, like an empty room. It was Jeannie's stepchildren carrying the loss of a woman who'd stayed close to them. The wait wasn't a pause between the interesting parts of the story. The wait was most of the story, measured in ordinary days that turned into ordinary years, while the answer to the whole thing sat locked in a genetic code that the technology of the time simply could not read the way it needed to be read. Then, the technology started to change. And in 2015, the Minneapolis Police Department resumed the case, pushed back into motion by how far DNA science had come since 1993. The evidence had been preserved well. That was the quiet gift the original investigators had left behind. They'd collected carefully and they'd stored it right, which meant that when the science finally caught up, there was something real and intact for it to work on. The profile was still good. The footprints were still on file. Everything the 1993 detectives had lifted out of Unit 2104 was waiting in usable condition for a method that hadn't been invented yet. That method was forensic genetic genealogy, and in 2018, investigators brought it to bear on the DNA that Jeannie's killer had left behind in 1993. It's worth understanding exactly what it does, because it's the reason this case broke, and it's the reason a whole category of cases that once looked hopeless are getting answered now. Start with what the old approach couldn't do. A criminal database like CODIS works by exact match. You take the crime scene profile and you ask the system a single narrow question. Is this specific person already in here? And the only people in there are the ones who've been convicted of qualifying crimes. If your killer has never been convicted of one, the honest answer the system gives you is nothing at all. That's the trap. Jeannie's case was stuck in for a quarter century. The DNA was flawless and the database was blind to it because the man it belonged to had kept his record clean enough to stay out of the one system built to catch him. Genetic genealogy walks around that trap instead of trying to break through it. Here's the idea. You don't upload the crime scene profile to a police database. You upload it to the consumer ancestry databases, the same kind of services where ordinary people send in a saliva sample to find out where their family came from, and connect with relatives they never knew they had. And you don't ask that database for an exact match, you ask it a wider, cleverer question. Who in here shares DNA with this unknown person? Not is this him, but who is he related to? And people share DNA in measurable amounts. A parent and child share about half. Cousins share less, second cousins less still, but it's there, and it's detectable, and it's specific. So the crime scene profile comes back not with the killer himself, but with a scatter of his relatives, a cousin here, a more distant cousin there. People who've never committed a crime in their lives and have no idea their own DNA is about to help solve one, because what they share with the unknown man is a set of common ancestors. From there, the work stops being chemistry and becomes genealogy, the patient building of family trees. Investigators and a forensic genealogist take those relatives and they work backward, up the branches to the shared ancestors, and then forward again, down the other branches, filling in the descendants, and they keep collapsing the possibilities, narrowing the tree, crossing off everyone who doesn't fit the hard facts of the crime. Wrong sex, crossed off. Wrong age to have been the man in that apartment in 1993, crossed off. Living in the wrong part of the country at the wrong time, crossed off. You take a whole sprawling family and you squeeze it down, constraint by constraint, until you're left with the people who could actually have been there. It turns an impossible question, who is this stranger, into a solvable one. Find the family, then find the man inside the family who fits. That's what happened with Jeannie's case. In 2018, the crime scene profile was submitted to a consumer genealogy database, myheritage.com, for exactly this kind of work. And a forensic genealogist took it from there, building outward from the relatives the database surfaced and eventually narrowed the field to a match to potentially 2 brothers in Minnesota. 2 men, siblings, either of whom the genetics could fit. And from those 2, investigators worked down to 1. His name was Jerry Westrom. And when they looked at him, the pieces that genetic genealogy can't see on its own began to line up with the pieces that it could. Westrom had lived in the Twin Cities region in the relevant era. He was raised in rural Minnesota and had spent his life in and around the metro area, a long-time local, a businessman. He was the right age. And he had a documented soliciting record, arrests for soliciting sex workers, which connected him to the world Jeannie had been living and working in when she was killed. None of that, on its own, would convict a man. But it's the kind of corroboration that tells investigators the tree collapsed onto the right branch. The genealogy pointed at Jerry Westrom, and everything they could learn about Jerry Westrom pointed back. Now they had a name. What they didn't yet have was his DNA, legally obtained, to lay directly against the profile from Unit 2104. You can build a family tree to a suspect, but a family tree isn't a fingerprint. To close the loop, investigators needed a sample of Jerry Westrom's own DNA. And they couldn't just knock on his door and ask for it, not without tipping him off, not before they were sure. So they did what investigators do in these cases. They waited for him to give it up himself. In January of 2019, FBI Special Agent Chris Bokers followed Jerry Westrom to a hockey arena. Not a youth rink, not a game Westrom was coaching. This was in Wisconsin, and it was his adult daughter's college hockey game. Westrom was there as a dad in the stands watching his kid play, the most ordinary and decent thing a father can be doing on a winter evening. And that ordinariness is the whole terrible point of it. The man the genealogy had spent months hunting toward, the man whose DNA had been sitting unmatched for 26 years, was a father at his daughter's game, indistinguishable from every other parent in the building. Boakers watched and waited. At some point, Westrom went out to the lobby, to the concession stand, and made a food order. Bokers said, and when he finished, he took a napkin and he wiped his mouth. Then Westrom threw the napkin and the food container into a lobby garbage can, and he walked back into the arena for the second period, back to his seat, back to watching his daughter with no idea what he'd just done. Agents moved in on the trash and recovered the napkin and the container. On that napkin was Jerry Westrom's DNA, freely discarded, no warrant needed for a thing a man throws in a public garbage can. They took the napkin to the lab, and the DNA from that napkin, the one he'd wiped his mouth with between periods of a hockey game, matched the unknown profile from the crime scene. It matched what the killer had left on the comforter. It matched what he'd left on the towel. After 26 years of pointing at a blank space, the profile finally had a face, and the face belonged to the man from the stands. In February of 2019, about a month after the napkin, investigators arrested Jerry Westrom. He was 52 years old. The man they took into custody wasn't the drifter or the stranger the case had spent 26 years imagining. He was a married father of 3 from Isanti, Minnesota, a town north of the Twin Cities. He'd been a businessman for most of his adult life. He'd owned a convenience store and gas station called Westrom's Corner, running it through the early 2000s, and after that he'd worked in crop insurance out in the St. Cloud area. His record held 2 DWI arrests and the 2 soliciting arrests. There was no violent felony on it. Nothing that would ever have put him in a criminal database. He had, in the most literal sense, hidden in plain sight, not by running or by covering his tracks, but simply by living an ordinary suburban life that no algorithm was built to flag. His family were, and are, private and innocent people. A wife and 3 children who'd built a life around a husband and a father, and who had no part in what he'd done in 1993 and no obligation to answer for it. They're not part of this story, except as more people the truth landed on. Jerry Westrom denied it. He denied any involvement, flatly, and he kept denying it. He was initially charged with second-degree murder, and on February 15, 2019, he posted bail. The amount was $500,000. He put it up and he walked out, a man out on bond while the case against him was built. His defense attorney, Stephen Meshbesher, would put the defense in 4 words that don't leave much room for nuance. You've got the wrong guy. But the case didn't stay at second-degree murder, and the reason it moved is worth understanding. Because the gap between the arrest and what came next isn't the case stalling. It's the case getting more serious. Under Minnesota law, first-degree premeditated murder, the most serious charge the state can bring, can't be filed by prosecutors on their own. It requires a grand jury. So prosecutors took the evidence to a Hennepin County grand jury, and on June 25, 2020, that grand jury indicted Jerry Westrom for first-degree premeditated murder. A warrant issued immediately on the indictment. The charge against him had climbed from second degree to the top count in the state, and now it carried the weight of a grand jury's finding that this was not just a killing, but a premeditated one. The trial came in August of 2022 in Hennepin County District Court in front of a jury. 29 years after Jeanie Ann Childs was killed in her apartment, 12 strangers sat down to decide who had done it. The state's case rested on the science, and it was formidable. Westrom's DNA wasn't just present at the scene in some ambiguous way. His semen was identified on the comforter and on a towel. His DNA was on the bloody bathroom items. A forensic scientist named Andrea Faya testified to the thing that had defined the case from the very beginning, that the unknown DNA, now known to be Westrom's, repeated itself throughout the crime scene. It wasn't in one spot where it might be explained away. It was everywhere the killer had been, exactly as it had been logged in 1993, and now it had his name on it. And then there were the footprints. The bare, bloody prints that Bart Epstein had spotted under the bedroom window in 1993, dusted with black powder and preserved for 29 years, came into that courtroom as evidence. A footprint expert for the prosecution, Mark Ulrich, testified that 4 of the prints were Westrom's. The thing the killer had pressed into the floor of Jeannie's bedroom on the day he murdered her had waited nearly 3 decades to be laid against the feet of the man in the defendant's chair. The defense fought the science where it could. Meshbesher held to the line, the wrong guy, and the defense put up its own footprint expert, a woman named Alicia McCarthy. She didn't dispute everything. She agreed that one print, labeled E2, the one below the left big toe, conclusively matched Jerry Westrom. But she challenged the other 3, arguing they weren't as certain as the prosecution claimed. The defense also pointed to loose threads in the record, unresolved details from a 29-year-old case, and asked the jury to see reasonable doubt in them. That's the defense's job, to test the state's proof at every seam, and Westrom was entitled to every bit of it. The jury took its time. They deliberated for 8 days. 8 days is a long deliberation, and it tells you these jurors didn't treat the decision lightly, that they went through the evidence carefully before they were willing to put their name to a verdict on a killing that happened when some of them may have been children. And at the end of those 8 days, they came back. They found Jerry Westrom guilty of first-degree premeditated murder and guilty of second-degree intentional murder as well. After 29 years, a jury had said, plainly and unanimously, that the man who killed Jeanie Ann Childs was Jerry Westrom, and that he'd meant to do it. On September 9, 2022, Westrom was sentenced. The sentence was life in prison. Under Minnesota law, that life sentence carries the possibility of parole after 30 years. He wouldn't get to ask for release for 3 decades, and there's no guarantee he'll ever be granted it. But the honest statement of the sentence is life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. And that's how it stands. Westrom was 56 years old when it came down. Jerry Westrom did what convicted men are entitled to do. He appealed, and the appeal matters because it's part of the honest record of this case, and because it changed one thing while leaving the heart of the verdict exactly where the jury had put it. The case went up to the Minnesota Supreme Court, and on May 8, 2024, the court issued its decision. It made one correction, and it was a technical one. The jury had convicted Westrom of both first-degree premeditated murder and second-degree intentional murder for the same killing, and the law doesn't allow a person to stand convicted of both degrees for a single death. So the court vacated the second-degree conviction, the lesser of the two counts, removing it as redundant. That's all that removal was. Not a finding that the evidence was weak, not a crack in the case, just the law tidying a defendant's record so it didn't carry two murder convictions for one murder. On everything that actually mattered, the court held firm. It affirmed the first-degree murder conviction. Westrom's lawyers had raised 6 other challenges to the case, and the court rejected all 6. The conviction for first-degree premeditated murder, the top count in the state of Minnesota, stood intact, and his sentence was unaffected. Life, with the possibility of parole after 30 years, unchanged. Westrom pushed further, all the way up. He filed a petition asking the United States Supreme Court to hear his case. The Supreme Court denied it. There would be no further review. With that denial, the conviction became final, in the fullest sense the American legal system has. Every court that could look at it had looked at it, and the answer held. Jerry Westrom killed Jeanie Ann Childs, and Jerry Westrom is a convicted first-degree murderer, and that is settled now in a way that no future filing is going to unsettle. He remains incarcerated in Minnesota, held in the St. Cloud area, the same stretch of the state where he'd once worked in crop insurance and lived his ordinary businessman's life. He is 30 years, at the earliest, from even being able to ask for release, and by then, he'll be an old man, if he's alive at all. Whatever the parole possibility says on paper, the practical shape of it is that the life Jerry Westrom built for himself, the store, the insurance job, the house in Asante, the evenings in the stands at his daughter's games, is over, and it ended because of a napkin he didn't think twice about throwing away. Sit for a moment with the strangeness of how the numbers line up in this case, because they carry the whole meaning of it. In June of 1993, Jerry Westrom was a man in his mid to late 20s, and he killed a 35-year-old woman and walked out of her apartment leaving his DNA in room after room, and for the next 26 years, none of it touched him. He aged from his 20s into his 50s, a free man. He ran a business. He raised 3 children to adulthood. He watched a daughter grow up enough to play hockey in college. He did all of that in the years that were stolen from Jeanie Ann Childs, who never got past 35, who never got to see her own life stretch into middle age the way her killer got to see his. And the thing that finally closed the distance between them wasn't luck, and it wasn't a confession. It was 2 forces meeting. One was a science that reached backward through 26 years to read a genetic signature the way it never could be read in 1993, and pull a name out of a family tree for a man who'd never once been in a criminal database, and by every ordinary measure never would be. The other force was a mother, Betty Eekman, who made the yearly calls into that empty room, who told anyone who'd listen that her daughter was still owed an answer, who never let a year go by without reminding them. The science could reach across the years, but somebody had to keep the case alive long enough on this side for the science to catch up to it. Betty was that somebody. She kept the door from closing. For a case that spent 26 years pointing at nobody, the answer, when it finally came, was almost unbearable in its ordinariness. The person who killed Jeanie Ann Childs turned out to be the least likely man in the room. Not a monster who looked the part, not a stranger with a long violent record, but a married suburban businessman and father, a man with no felony to his name, who'd been sitting in the stands at a hockey game while an FBI agent waited for him to throw away a napkin. Everything about Jerry Westrom's life had been camouflage, and none of it was deliberate. He didn't hide. He just lived the kind of unremarkable life that the machinery built to catch killers was never designed to see. That's the piece of this case that reaches past Jeanie into cases that haven't been solved yet. Forensic genetic genealogy reaches exactly the killers that traditional DNA databases can never surface. The ones with no criminal record at all, the ones who go home after and raise families and grow old and never give the system a reason to fingerprint them. For decades, those were the untouchable ones. A perfect crime scene profile and no one to match it against was a dead end, and everybody in law enforcement knew it. Jeanie's case is a textbook demonstration of the thing that changed. It shows, start to finish, how you take a genetic signature that belongs to no one in any police database and still walk it, relative by relative, branch by branch, all the way to a name and a front door. What used to be the hardest kind of case to solve became a solvable one, and Jeanie Ann Childs is one of the reasons we know it works. But the science is only half of why her name has an answer attached to it now, and it's the lesser half. The other half was a family that refused to let go. When the trial finally came in the summer of 2022, Betty Eekman and Cindy Bloomer were there to see it. 29 years is long enough that so many families in these cases don't make it to the verdict that the people who loved the victim most go to their own graves without ever hearing a jury say the name of the person who did it. Betty and Cindy didn't. They lived to sit in that Hennepin County courtroom and hear 12 strangers, after 8 days of weighing every piece of it, find Jerry Westrom guilty. The mother who'd spent a lifetime chasing her runaway daughter and then a second lifetime chasing her daughter's killer got to be in the room when the chase ended. And what they carried into that room wasn't a case file. It was a person. It was the girl who lost her way at 12 and kept running, and the mother who kept going after her anyway. It was the little sister, 12 years behind, who grew up watching Jeanie and never forgot the way she moved when the music was right. All through the years when the world called Jeanie's case unsolvable, when the coverage was scant and the profile matched no one and the phone calls seemed to go nowhere, her family had held on to the thing the system kept losing sight of, which was that Jeanie was real, that she'd been here, that she'd snapped her fingers and danced around the room when Lionel Richie came on, and that a life like that doesn't stop mattering just because of how it ended or how she'd been living when it did. The wait had cost them everything a wait like that costs. Betty had made her yearly reminders into an entire second vocation. Cindy had grown from a young woman into middle age, with the question hanging over the family the whole way. And still, when the science finally arrived to do the part no amount of love could do on its own, there was a family standing on the other side of the years, still asking, still there, ready to receive the answer they'd never stopped believing they were owed. What made those 8 days of deliberation as long as they were is that the defense didn't only say the words "the wrong guy" and sit down. It gave the jury specific threads to pull on, unresolved details from a 29-year-old crime scene, and asked whether they added up to reasonable doubt. Those threads are worth laying out plainly because they were part of the record the jury weighed, and because the men whose names came up in them are owed the same care as anyone else in this story. None of them was the killer. Each deserves to be named cleanly and left that way. There was, first, a piece of biological evidence that did not match Jerry Westrom. Semen recovered from Jeanie's purple underwear was tested, and it wasn't his. The defense held that up as a question the state couldn't fully answer. It never resolved to another attacker, and it never unmade the mountain of Westrom's own DNA that repeated itself through every room. But it was there, unmatched, and the defense made sure the jury saw it. There was a man named John Eswine. His blood was found near Jeanie's in a stairwell, and to a defense looking for doubt, blood in a stairwell is the kind of loose end you point at. But John Eswine was cleared. Whatever put a trace of him in that stairwell, the investigation resolved that he had nothing to do with Jeanie's murder, and he stands cleared of it. His name belongs in this story only so that it can be set down and left in peace, and there was a man named James Luther Carlton. Carlton had been convicted of a similar murder committed in 1994, a year after Jeanie died, and in the earliest DNA work on Jeanie's case, from a mixture of genetic material, he couldn't be positively excluded. The defense wanted to put him in front of the jury as an alternative suspect, to say, in effect, look elsewhere. But the court examined it, and ruled that there was insufficient evidence to present James Luther Carlton to the jury as an alternate suspect. An inability to exclude someone from an early mixed sample is not evidence that he did it, and the judge would not let a mixture do the work of an accusation. Carlton was not charged in Jeannie's death, and nothing in this case makes him her killer. So that was the shape of the fight in that Hennepin County courtroom. On one side, the state's evidence, dense and repeating and specific. Westrom's semen on the comforter and on a towel, his DNA on the bloody bathroom items. The profile Andrea Faya testified had repeated itself throughout the crime scene, and the bloody barefoot prints dusted in black powder in 1993 and preserved for 29 years, 4 of them tied to Westrom by the prosecution's expert Mark Ulrich, with even the defense's own expert Alicia McCarthy conceding that the E2 print below the left big toe conclusively matched him. On the other side, the defense's unmatched underwear sample, its cleared stairwell name, its excluded alternate suspect, and Stephen Meshbesher's steady insistence that the jury had the wrong guy. For 8 days, 12 people held both of those against each other. They didn't rush it. They took the doubt seriously enough to spend more than a week inside it, and at the end, they were unanimous. The unmatched sample, the loose threads, the alternate names, none of it outweighed a killer's DNA laid down in room after room of the apartment where Jeanie Ann Childs died, or a bare bloody footprint pressed into her bedroom floor that belonged to the man in the defendant's chair. They convicted him of first-degree premeditated murder. The doubt the defense had built didn't hold, because the science underneath the state's case didn't leave it anywhere to stand. For 26 years, the answer to who killed Jeanie Ann Childs sat in plain sight, written in a genetic code that no database could read and no detective could name. It took a science that didn't exist in 1993 and a mother who refused to let a single year go by without asking to close the distance. In the end, it came down to a father in the stands at his daughter's game, a napkin dropped in a lobby trash can, and a match that finally gave a 26-year silence a name. Jerry Westrom will spend the rest of his life answering for what he did, and the answer, when it came, was final. But he isn't the person this story is for. Jeanie is. She was the girl who lost her way at 12 and kept running, and whose mother kept running after her anyway. She was the big sister a little girl looked up to. She was 35 years old, and she never got the decades her killer stole and spent. And she was the woman whose fingers started snapping the moment a Lionel Richie song came on, who couldn't hear music she loved without dancing around the room. That's who waited all those years for justice. Not a case file. A person. Justice arrived late for her, far too late for it to be anything but late, but it arrived. And it arrived because the people who loved her never once agreed to forget. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, and Jeanie Ann Childs stays remembered for who she was, a daughter, a sister, a woman who danced, and not just for how her story ended.